two of our speakers who've been here previously. So David Clifford, who's the lead quantitative researcher from the Climate Corporation, and Dennis Buckmaster, who's from Purdue University and been involved in a whole range of different areas, including the OADA platform and data standards in the US. And then our third speaker, Jonathan Dyer. I think he decided he was the token farmer amongst the panel, but Jonathan has been a Nuffield scholar and spent a whole project looking at issues around digital agriculture. So he's been on the ground and had a look at it, and in his spare time is actually involved in farming at on the Wimmera. So I guess we'll bring a hard-nosed practical reality to the panel. So I'm going to start off in a very simple fashion by commenting or seeking responses around this issue of is this whole digital agriculture space hype, or is there real productivity and potentially profitability advances to be made, and therefore it needs to be developed and nurtured. So, Jonathan, I'm going to start with you rather than the other two. What are your thoughts? Is this the next revolution in agriculture, or are we just getting carried away with fancy toys?
Yeah, wow, thanks for having me along. I think it is, but from my point of view, and my travels last year, I was looking at things from the on-farm point of view and what we can learn on-farm, and it really is. We keep hearing the word step change, but it's a new understanding for us farmers, is how we look at our farms, because instead of looking at, in grain production, so instead of looking at fields, paddocks as units, we can now, of course, go much deeper than that, and we work with the natural world, and that's a lot of variability. So I guess from my point of view, it enables us to have a deeper understanding of the interactions going on in our farm. But that's a different way of thinking about your farm, I think, perhaps, than what we've been used to.
David?
It's definitely the next revolution. We have people working with us who talk about growers farming by the foot. We want to be in that space. We want to be able to execute any decision in the field, and we want to have the models and the data to back it up. I was going to make another point. It's escaped my mind, actually. I'll just pass it on to Dennis.
It'll come back.
Yeah, it will.
Dennis, you're a bit more neutral. What's your observation?
There is some hype, but it is real. I am convinced of that. I kind of made a note of some things that I wanted to remind us of that we saw in the last day and a half. And one is that it enables larger than a field, larger than a farm, optimization. So think back to a couple of presentations that dealt with optimization on a very large scale. And one that came to mind was the Clear Grain Exchange, this idea of a firm offer. How about that on the input side, not just on the output side? There's some new opportunities there. It is going to require, and I fully agree, I think it was Roz who mentioned that it's knowledge workers in agriculture. That's where we need to be.
Okay. And I suppose we're going to challenge you with that second question that we posed right at the start as well. If we had a wand, what are the things that need to happen, do you think, in Australia, Jonathan, to I guess, optimise the development of these sorts of opportunities?
Well, I think we covered the first one off pretty well this morning. Connectivity. But once you have that, it's kind of like what I said in the answer to my first question is almost the same answer. It's that new mindset and thinking about your business in a new way. And so learning about what's possible, you can't fix the problem until you know that solution's out there. So.
I spoke about this last night. We're trying to figure out what's required to come and work here in Australia, and as a data scientist, for me, the primary concerns are around key pieces of information, like the soils and the weather. And I've had some great conversations with Vernon from the Bureau of Meteorology here, and he assures me we do have the weather data, so it's really about the soils, and be picking your brains later, Mike, about that. So yeah, data is the big thing. And then it's about tapping into the expertise here in the room also about the agronomy that takes place here in Australia. The soils are different, and so the models we have built in the US for agricultural processes might not be the same as we would implement here, because it's a different game, basically. So we want to partner with the right people, collaborate with the right researchers, and figure out how to build those models for Australia.
Yes, and yes, and then also trust. But honestly, I sit here and I had sat there all this time, and I don't think I heard anyone up here that I wouldn't trust. I'm not going to believe everything they say, but I think they're trustworthy people here in this business. But I did have an observation, and I shared it with just a couple people. When I drive and I carry my phone, Google knows how fast I'm going, but they don't report it to the police so that I would get a ticket. I have, and I'm pointing the finger at me now, I have probably a little more trust in Google than I do agoem.com. Why is it that I'm so skeptical of agoem.com, but yet I trust Google? So a little bit of self-reflection probably is in order for me, and it relates to this trust.
I'm happy to take comments, questions from the audience. We've got a couple of microphones around, so anyone who wants to make some comments or join the conversation or impart some observations, we'd be happy to hear from you. I mean, I think the interesting thing is 5 years down the track, where do you three see this sort of development in agriculture, the digital agriculture development? Do you see it as reasonably quickly becoming a routine way of operation on farm? Jonathan, could you imagine that, where, you know, it's just as routine to jump in the Hilux with an iPad and head out as it is to do whatever you do now? Is that the sort of environment we're heading into, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I'm hoping to go out and get a tablet to kind of permanently install on one of our tractors in the next few weeks. So for sure it's going to happen. I think it was Ben said, was it Ben said this morning about he hates the term precision agriculture and preferred to call it digital agriculture. I think eventually it'll just be called farming. Because like I said a moment ago, natural world, variability. It makes sense to treat different parts of your farm differently. So I think so.
One of the points I wanted to make earlier is, you know, when we think about digital agriculture and what value we get from it right now, and I spoke about this last night as well, it's hard to put a yield value on that because of the variability in performance. But some of the value comes from not what you get directly from digital agriculture, but what it enables you to do beyond it. So using these tools frees up your time to think about other things. And Suzanne McCleary, who's here from Monsanto, raised this point with me about the experience of cotton growers who used to spend time and time again having to spray their crops over the course of a year. And as soon as the Bollgard versions of cotton came in, it freed up their time to think about things like nutrition and to think about things like seeding rate and product placement. And it's what digital agriculture enables the growers to do is where the real value of it comes from, I think.
Well, I have a current grad student who really is an agronomist turned something else, and she's pointed out to me that her interests generally are not what is average. It's the points that are far from average that are more interesting and can lead to insights. So I think this 5 years down the road is when we take advantage of the data that we have, the insights that we can gain, to learn about the variability and the uncertainty And, you know, maybe today there's this much uncertainty, but with a little bit of structure and data, we can at least reduce the uncertainty and have a little more confidence in our decisions. I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Malcolm Wagner from the University of Queensland. I guess I'd like to go back and reflect on the question that Ros, I think, posed in the very first session about whether this is going to evolve as a shared market or a monopolistic market. If it's a shared market, I'm sure the cake is going to be bigger. But if it develops as a monopolistic sort of situation where one major provider, like the Microsoft of ag data providers, you know, there's a strong profit motive for companies to try and strive for that sort of dominant position. Or will we end up like Woolworths and Coles in Australia, a couple of dominant players in the market? Is there anything we can do to direct this business into the outcome that we'd like to see?
Should I ask for responses from the panel?
You can. I mean, there might be other people in the audience who've got a comment on that.
So the issue of like support and service and subscription fees was mentioned a few times, and I guess if you really want to drive a varied market, people need to start paying for services with various different providers of these services, and that's really going to encourage more and more people to come in and get involved.
Dennis, what's your observation of the market in the US? Is it, I mean, I was impressed when I visited recently the diversity of different players in all different parts of this sort of collective area called digital agriculture. Is that, do you see that changing much, consolidating, growing?
It's a very fuzzy crystal ball, but I see it evolving to a much smaller list of players. At the moment, it's the innovative stage where lots of startups, lots of varying views and avenues to go. It's probably a little bit like in, you know, since I'm from the US, Detroit, there are the big three. And in ag equipment, there are big three. I don't know that we're going to end up with three, but I think it's going to be a smaller number. If we think back, and I suppose it's the same here as it was there. Once upon a time, there were hundreds, literally hundreds of seed companies, and then it boiled down to 3 or 4. Now those 3 or 4 have multiple brands under them, but still, you know, nominally 3 or 4. So there's going to be some consolidation and of that. But then these decisions that we're making are so diverse that there is, you know, just look at pasture land type decision making is quite different than wheat land decision making. So that may just be a separate entity just because of those core competencies that build the decision tools. So, you know, I guess one estimate on a dart on the wall would be 4 or 5 in each enterprise area at the most, kind of thing.
Christian, middle there.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make a comment about what needs to happen in Australia, and it's really picking up back right from your talk at the start, Dennis, and it really comes. The 6 C's were mentioned, and so I've come up with a 7th C, and that is called co-learning, and that comes back to your idea of teams. And in Tasmania, we've already worked out that 2 heads are better than 1. But seriously, and I think the other area that may not have been touched on, but maybe when we have this forum again, we'll start talking about it. And that's really not so much data, but talking about knowledge, because data becomes information, becomes knowledge. And really the tools around being able to learn from our past experience to deal with the current situation, which is what we do when we work in teams. We remember what happened in the past to help us deal with what we have to do today, with the logistics of today. And so it'd be nice to see some more artificial sort of intelligence. Where is the artificial intelligence going to go to help us do that? And but if you think there's something that has been brought up around that'd be great. So yeah, just your thoughts on how do we do all this work together? We've got private sector, public sector. There's been some great examples like SST Logistics of how you do that in a private sense, but how do we bring the various players in and work together? Sorry, that was very long.
Good.
I don't know whether we're going to do a Tony Jones or actually refer it as a question, so we'll try as a question.
Where was the fellow I had breakfast with this morning? Is he here? I don't see him. But it was is that the Sheep CIC? Is that?
James Rowe, was it?
Yes. He had a very interesting story about this team that came together and produced a product in very short order, and it required co-learning. I mean, here we are in, the city of Sydney, but I consider this room rural Australia, and they were working with classic San Francisco coders, which they didn't know what a sheep looked like, but still came with something that was productive out of that. So it was very much that team effort. Sometimes it's better to have a team member that doesn't know too much. They don't have preconceived notions. So there's some advantage to that.
I've got a question over.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah Nolette. We've seen lots of really cool technologies over the last 2 days, and we've also heard about challenges on the grower and production side, and definitely talked about the need to translate across that gap. But I'm curious, Dennis and Jonathan, what you've seen in terms of actually doing that, and David, how you guys are actually trying to do that. Is it usability testing? Is it pilots? What are sort of the strategies that you're using to actually bridge that gap?
So maybe, David, how does Climate Corp, for example, ground test or work out whether they're heading in the right track or not?
So we have our research farms where we run experiments important to our models. We have research partners then that are spread more broadly across the Corn Belt, and we work closely with them, and we ask them to implement specific trials on their fields and incentivize them to help us out with that and gain some insights from those experiments about the value we're adding or our ability to implement different kinds of schemes in the field. And then in terms of the actual look and feel of the app, we do quite a lot of user testing, getting feedback from growers, understanding what they want to see and where it should be placed and how to put the thing together. And then the really important way we bridge the gap between what we talk about and what's implemented is just looking at the analytics around the tool itself. So when someone's using our system, you can track what they're doing through time. You can see they click here and they go over there and they put in some pieces of information, and then you can quickly find out for the people who didn't actually make it the whole way through implementing Nitrogen Advisor, for example, you can find out where they failed to continue, and you can then talk to people and try and understand what blocked them at that point. Was it just a piece of information that's really hard to get your hands on? They couldn't find it. It was non-intuitive, and then you can try and improve what you're doing. So many different ways to evaluate how we engage with users and how we bridge the gap between what we think we're implementing and what actually gets implemented in the field.
That was a very good answer that covers a lot of what I probably would have said. One key interesting word to look up, you should Google pretotyping. It's very applicable to this space. It's the notion of not necessarily building it and then testing it. It's to pretend that you have it, to see the reaction to it before you ever build it. It's a fascinating couple of free PDFs out there about pretotyping. It's an interesting approach.
Paul?
I've always wanted to have the opportunity to use a quote from Mao Zedong in such a context. So, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. Now we've got all of these different things that have been shown. They are contending, it'll be dramatic and exciting, but the Cultural Revolution ended up with an awful mess. And My question...
He fixed that by chopping all their heads off.
Well, that's right. Which of course, is a model that we might choose to adopt in Australian high-technology agriculture. But the question goes back to the governance issue. You know, what kind of approach to governing competition, development, benefit for landholders, what sort of approaches do you think are needed? And what sort of action is needed now if we are going to shape the playing field rather than just play on it?
That might be closer to Dennis's areas of interest, I think.
You're asking me to give a quick response, and I think that one honestly requires some deep thought. I hate to just put it off, but I don't want to give a knee-jerk response to something that's very... let me ponder that a little bit.
We have a question here, and then one over there.
My question is for Jonathan. As someone that farms in the part of the world with the most income volatility of all farmers in agriculture, and someone who has a tax system that totally encourages capital investment as a way when you have excess cash to invest, what do you think about software as a service as a business model?
Yeah, I nearly picked up on that on the previous question. Chris, sort of to try to, I guess, address this thing about, and David, you guys want people to pay for software and kind of the reluctance of farmers to do it. I'll explain to you guys briefly, as much as I can, my business model. We've just finished seeding. We've had enough rain to get our crops about this high. We are now waiting and hoping that it will rain sometime between now and September, and we will get something back from them. Income volatility. So the Wimmera's had quite poor seasons the last 2 years. There's been very little profit in farming, frankly. The previous 4 years to that were quite good. So we kind of have this incongruity, I suppose, between software companies who want a regular income and us farmers who want a regular income, but we can't get it, and so we just can't, going to be very reluctant, I guess, to sign up to something that requires regular contributions when we're not sure if we're going to be able to service them. That's why as much as we all hate it, I guess, this paying lots of money for software once, I guess that's kind of why that's the model we understand. And I know it's not a good one, and we don't like it either, because in 5 years we have to do it again and we don't like it. But I guess, does that sort of help explain to guys a bit why we're a bit reluctant at times?
I think that volatility of income is certainly something vastly different here in Australia compared to, well, virtually anywhere
compared
else.
to the Midwest, yeah.
So it's an interesting issue, isn't it? We have a question right down the back there.
I would just want to follow up on the co-learning process, as well as touch on the discussion on the issue of governance that's been raised. Taking the experience in the US and wanting to catalyze this process in Australia, where do you see the role of, if you look at the presentation summed up particularly over the part of yesterday and today, there's been a plethora of private activity, commercial activities ongoing. Where do you see specific roles of government in catalyzing the process? And where do we draw the line in terms of what the private can do? Is it the role of government or is it the role of the commercial sector to overcome one of the principal issues, which is governance structure? We heard earlier about data ownership. Who owns it? So which component of the trajectory would government do and not impede commercial activity? So how do we ensure that that occurs seamlessly, taking all the experiences from US?
To give a completely honest answer to that one, I'll have to disclose my political preferences. which personally are let government be small when government can be small. And so I think there's some things to learn, just to ponder there. If it's an infrastructure thing, that seems logical that the government would facilitate or be involved in some way. If it's needs and profitability driven, that's where free enterprise is most successful, and the government should get out of the way. So I think there's going to be some balance of that. Of course, I suppose it's the same here as it is in the U.S. Part of the role of the government is to, in part, support the educational institutions, which is going to play the role of educating the next set of knowledge workers. So that is a role, I think, that the government, through educational institutions and outreach, sort of that difference between extension and advice that we talked about yesterday, but they can contribute to the knowledge base so that people understand the terminology and some of those things.
Okay.
So I did think of some responses to the tough question about governance, and it's not a complete answer, but I think most people will probably agree clarity and fairness are a key part of that governance. Transparency, I don't really like the word, but everybody uses it, and I think we understand what it means, so I'll use it. We do need to consider the social implications, because I noticed from watching some TV here in Australia while here that it's about the same in the U.S. There are a lot of people who maybe are more involved in the political realm than we are, who don't understand agriculture at all. And so to take data and make it public, honestly, it could be misused. So we need to at least be thinking about it. We might not do too many things different, but to put our head in the sand and not consider it would be unwise. I really liked the session a little while ago, which emphasized the role of contracts as opposed to law, because that is a way to more clearly communicate the two sides. Here's what we intend to do. Okay, I say okay. And then, I don't know if it's governance directly, but in statistics, and I forget what you'll know, maybe David will have to correct me here, but there is a type 1 and a type 2 error in statistics. One is making a conclusion when you shouldn't, and the other one is concluding something, or not concluding something when you should have. And it relates to risk, and that's how you choose your P level. And so in this governance realm, and we're negotiating a contract, should I use your service or not? I need to assess, well, if I don't, what do I stand to lose? And if I do, but it goes sour in some way, what do I stand to lose? And to consider those in an upfront and transparent and honest communication way, that's a part of that governance model, really.
David Houghton from MarketCheck. Following on from that, I think there's been a lot of talk about the value and importance of information and data. And in the earlier sessions today, they touched on the ownership of data. I'd like to get the panel's opinion on that, coming obviously from research backgrounds and analytic backgrounds, and where they see the ownership of the data they collect in their professions.
Jonathan, be a good one.
Yeah. Good question. Who owns the money in your bank account? The bank does. But do you care? No, as long as it's there when you want it. We need to stop talking about who owns farm data, because it's a misnomer, and we've heard it at this conference. Farmers own data, who owns it's irrelevant. It's who can access it, and what are they doing with it. Yeah. So in terms of ownership, we keep hearing who owns it. Well, it's the farmers, but well, actually, when I generate data on farm, I'm using, I don't want to pick on any one particular brand, but I'm using a certain type of a brand of tractor which has software that was written on it by that. It gets sent up into the cloud, which is owned and run by that same company, and I then access that data using software that that company has written. But I own the data. Does that matter? Who can access it, and what are they doing?
Any variations on that view on the panel?
Our position is it's farmers' data, and it's our responsibility to keep it private on behalf of the grower as well. So.
A day and a half ago, I would have said it's the farmer's data. But in light of the analogy this morning about I am me, but a picture of me, you took the picture, you owned the photo, it's got me thinking in a different way. You know, and it's true.
Okay, we've got one down the back. One, two.
Yeah, just to reflect on Jonathan's statement then, I think what gets lost in that is that often there's been investment in equipment on farm, and that's private investment that's led to the generation of the data. And so, you know, ownership is one discussion, but the other discussion is if there's value being generated out of that data up the supply chain, then how does the farmer get some sort of return on that investment of the equipment that they put in place to actually generate it? I think we've got to have this idea of value sharing. As the value of the data increases up the supply chain, then how can we make sure that some of that value flows back to where that original investment was made?
I'll just add, follow on to that, sort of in the theme of this is a conference that should just open our thinking. We're not going to take action until tomorrow, probably. But if I'm a corn grower and I grow corn, I sell the corn. What the next person does with that corn is value added. They're going to make ethanol or corn syrup or corn meal or whatever. They don't have to pay me again for the corn that I sold them because I got my reward. So I'm not convincing myself, I'm just thinking about it. I have this data. And if let's say I'm Jonathan and I get my data and I get what I want out of my data. If someone else value adds on that, but I've already gotten what I want, what I deserve, then why should I rein in on it? I don't know, just a thought. They're value adding to data just like they value added to the product, the physical product.
Hi, gents. Mark Swift. The context of the Australian agricultural market, it's large, it's sparse, it's low value, it's got the tyranny of distance in spades, and a very small population to go with it. How are we going to build a support network to deal with all this disruption and get the capacity out there to overcome these barriers? The potential's there. The money saving and the capital growth that could come from this is immense. But actually enacting it's an entirely different beast. Have you got any thoughts on how we might fulfill the promise?
So I'll jump in here first. I came to this conference this week after spending a year and a half working in this space in the US, but having spent 10 years working and doing research here in Australia. And I arrived here this week with this sense that I had a good understanding of what it was like here to work in this space, and quickly realized that I need to do a lot more homework. The differences between the US and Australia are dramatic, and just exactly the issues you raised. So one of the takeaways for me from this week is to go back and put a lot more thought and effort into thinking about things from the perspective of the grower here, which is something we've been doing in the US, but it's something I took for granted, I think, so far. But
I think we're over here.
Yes, I really wanted to get back to what Jonathan was saying about data. I'm Mark Perry from the University of New England. I'm a lawyer. I think the problem is that the words ownership and even access are the wrong words to use when you're talking about information, and data is really just the foundation of information. What you're talking about is control. So if on my farm I generate tons of data using all different products and software and soil testing bomb data, etc., etc., and I give it to, say, AgX and upload it there. And I'm happy with them, but they start stuffing their fees up, and it gets, I want to change company. And if the agreement is that they now have control of my data, I can't pull my data out and give it to the Climate Corporation, for example. So the control of the information, the control of the data is what's important. And that's something that information lawyers like myself have been thinking about for the last 30 years or so.
Thanks.
Yeah, completely agree. But the thing, I guess, because I'm the nerd farmer, you know, like everyone says the farmers own the data, right? But say we mentioned the big three machinery companies, and they all say the same thing. They all say the farmers own their data, and kind of, you know, the dealers and the salespeople have been trained to say that, and that's what they say. Because I'm the nerd farmer, I actually looked up, you know, their terms and agreements page, and all three of them are completely different. So what that means is different for each company. So yeah, we have like you say, we do have a definitions issue here.
Will we take last two? All right, last two. Yes, you.
Hello, Joanne Reesing from DAF in Townsville. I had just a couple things, and of course I wrote them on a note on my smartphone, so I have to open that up. The first one was, it's been interesting listening to all this talk about standards and IoT, and I guess one of the things I wonder is we're not Robinson Crusoe. This is going across all industries, all sectors, all parts of our life. And so the discussion we have can't be isolated from that larger discussion, and they may make decisions on standards and governance and rules that overarch and obliterate ours. So are we working together with the larger IoT world in setting up our governance? And just a couple other things I just want to talk about, and they've just come up over and over. I work a lot with Remote Queensland, and I think one of the issues I have is that it's really hard to, you don't know what you don't know. And as you've mentioned, it's hard to subscribe to something on cost, but it's even harder if you don't know what it is and you've never seen it work and you've never played around with it and you've never found out that I really don't like putting my data in that way. And I think there need to be a lot more trial versions, trial subscriptions, and I suppose the other one that comes with remoteness is that we need cached offline data and tools for just about everything, because there are times when there is no connectivity. And if all of your decision support and control is on the cloud and you have no cloud, or you have lots and lots of clouds, which is preventing you from getting satellite, you may not want to invest in this at all. So I guess there's three things. I'm just interested in offline caching for every product. I'm interested in IoT standardization across industry, and I'm interested in trial versions of things so that people can play.
So I think I mentioned this last night, but we do offer trial versions of our software to growers. We give people, I think, 120 acres for free, and then based on how big your operation is, the price per acre will change based on the size of it. Last year it was an even better deal. It was your whole farm for a set fee, no matter if you had, well, if you had a very small farm, it was not such a good deal, but if you had a huge farm, it was a great deal. And in the US, we don't have the same level of connectivity problems that I think people have here, but we do have some, and we do have some caching offline capability with the tools for those parts of the country where it's needed. But I'm not sure off the top of my head what level that is. Is it just a case of if it drops out for a minute or two, you're fine, or can you go about your business for the whole day and come back to base and then sync it to the cloud that way? I'm not sure of the level.
Okay, we're going to take our last question.
David Freeburn, University of Southern Queensland. My early career was collecting data, and it was my data. And I look back and I think I must have been a real turd then, the way I and all my colleagues behaved, because it was our data. In fact, it probably belonged to the Queensland government. But guess who still looks after my data? Me. Because no one else cared. Now, I'd speculate that of all the agronomic work that have been done just over the last 10 years, had been stored, not all of it, but the good stuff, stored and was available, that Climate Corp would be very keen to access it, as would we. Or now I find myself as an app developer, and I dearly want some data to test it. Fortunately, there is very little, so the model will be right. So I'm with you, David. But Climate Corp will have the advantage that the data it collects, which you say belongs to farmers, you will have access to improve your models. Jonathan, the money that you put in the bank, you don't care who really owns it until you do want it back. We're in a position where a lot of that money has disappeared. So I guess my question is to Dennis, really. I sense that the US scientific community have a better ethos of sharing and data archiving than we do, and maybe that's where the research community could set the tone and change its culture, or the farming community will probably leapfrog and show generosity of spirit and hope that it can be value added. But I'm really interested in your reflections on that ethos of data sharing.
We're moving in that direction, but honestly, I don't think we're as far ahead as you may think we are in terms of openly sharing the data. There is some movement to do it more so because a government-funded project from NSF or USDA, in the end, sometime, maybe a year after that project closes, the data must be published and available. And through GoDan and some other, there's our National Ag Library has some standards for making that data available. They don't want to host it, but they just have some terminology to make it available. Increasingly, it will happen. And I guess right alongside the release of the research data should come, and we're going to try to model this at Purdue, hopefully we can get it done very soon, is in addition to the publication, we published the data, and we published the code that was written to analyze the data. And I had this conversation with someone yesterday. You know, the dream, the ideal research publication would have been written in such great detail that someone else could completely replicate what you did. Well, that's rarely the case. But if there was a data set and this was the code, then indeed someone could exactly replicate what you did and build upon it to that next generation. As new insights come from a different context, then well, let's refine that algorithm and do it even better. So I think there will be a move in that direction, but we aren't there yet. We are thinking about it.
Okay. Yeah. I think I'll draw it to a close because we did say we'd finish at 4 o'clock and we're just a tick over that now. I think in summing up, the impression I've certainly gained over the last couple of days is there's a pretty strong view that the productivity potential is evident. And it may not necessarily be measured in greater output, it may be measured in terms of increased convenience, increased ease of management, some of those sort of less tangible issues that are probably there evident in, for example, the BT Cotton story. So I think that aspect of the discussion that we've had and that first question undoubtedly seems to be answered in the affirmative. If we looked at some of the impediments we've talked about, telecommunications access certainly has come up as a very strong issue. I think the density of weather and climate data is one that sticks out. The availability of the comprehensive type soil information, not that it's an end into itself, but it's a great starting point in terms of a lot of the modelling that needs to occur. I guess the other issue we've got here, and it was touched on, is the diversity of production systems and environments in which farmers operate. I would classify the Corn Belt as a monoculture, one type of soil and one crop. That's obviously a much simpler proposition than the diversity of agriculture we see here and the mixed enterprise systems that are more common. And that then leads into the volume of data specific to varieties, livestock performance, environmental and soil interactions. And I think in some respects that touched on that question before, that a lot of the data specific to those sorts of things are in public resource information, and whether that's readily available and able to be accessed by developers, I think is an interesting question. And then that leads on to the lack of integration between public and private data sets. For example, we've got a fantastic resource in the National Livestock Identification Scheme, which in effect is a railway track of information for the beef cattle industry, but I think we're only just starting to think about how do we integrate that public data, government data, with some of the private offerings that might be available. So there's, and then a competitive software development sector. I wonder whether the market in Australia is in fact big enough to sustain a competitive software developing sector that would have the patience and the patient capital required to bring these products to fruition and turn them into a viable commercial product. I think that is an interesting question as well. So I guess they're the negatives. I think on the positive side, I take a lot of heart from the presentations by Murray Schultz and Tim Condon. So in both those instances, Murray was talking about the connectiveness issue and him not waiting for someone to turn up with a solution, actually finding a solution and implementing it himself. And I think that gives you great heart that some of those problems can be overcome. Same with Delta Ag, you know, the classic case of when is the government ever going to put in enough weather stations to get some of these models working at a local level to a point where they're actually usable. They're not, so go out and put them in yourself and find a model, a business model that actually overcomes that limitation. So I think I'm optimistic that the sort of innovative and go and do it approach that we hope is typical in Australia will actually help to overcome a lot of those impediments. I mean, I think the major challenge is, and we've been dancing around it a bit, but it always struck me that the issue is that individually a single farm's data for a single year is not a great deal of use. Let's be honest about it. It really doesn't generate much in the way of insights or value. But if you can combine large volumes of that data over large numbers of farms for large numbers of different situations, then you start to get to something that is actually quite valued. So one of the challenges, I think, with this whole area of digital agriculture is it does require some collective approaches, and Australian farmers are hopeless at collective approaches relative to their cousins in other jurisdictions. So I think, you know, individually these sorts of problems we're talking about are quite challenging. Collectively they could easily be overcome, but the difficult bit will be getting that collective approach to some of these issues. So I leave you with the challenge, I guess, of trying to think through how we overcome some of those problems collectively, knowing that individually you can't